Three, two, one. Hello, Veronica. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, Martin. Super excited to join you in your podcast.
So am I. So am I. And to anybody listening, Veronica is very well acquainted with the topic of languages. Of course, you speak six languages fluently. You do public speaking in all of your different languages. But can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so my core topic and what I try to do is to drive inclusion. And how I do that is through three main streams. One is through consulting. So I do a lot of freelance consulting for companies mostly in Asia Pacific. I'm based in Hong Kong. The second stream is public speaking. I go to events, I go to conferences. Last week I was in Singapore speaking at a summit about inclusive language, which is very relevant. And I also am a writer. I published two books, my first two books, and a third book co-authored. And I'm in the process of publishing the next one. So it's definitely one of my big passions as well. So I use all these different channels to drive inclusion, to help companies build more inclusive teams. And in a nutshell, that's me.
Perfect, perfect. And that's very exciting. Like you mentioned with your third book, we'll definitely keep an eye out on that. But I want to ask you a little bit more about what you just mentioned with inclusive language. What does that mean to you? What's your personal definition of inclusive language?
So inclusive language is speaking in a way that makes people feel included, that makes people feel like they're part of the conversation. And the reality is we don't realize it, but in our day-to-day, we very often using a language that might not make people always feel included. So to give some very specific examples, we speak a language that is very binary based. So we tend to think male or female, we tend to say hello, ladies and gentlemen. The reality is that gender has evolved. It's not binary anymore. There are people who identify as non-binary. And by changing one word, and instead of saying hello, ladies and gentlemen, saying hi all, we just make it inclusive. It doesn't matter how you identify. I just want to make sure that you feel included. And this is just one example, but there are so many. For example, we very often use the term inclusive needs. When we say, oh, yeah, this person has inclusive needs, maybe that person is in a wheelchair and needs a ramp. In reality, that person doesn't have a special need. That person has accessibility requests. That person needs to access a place or a venue or a meeting. And when we change the language, we are actually making sure that we are making people part of the conversation. So that's why I'm so passionate, because it's not only about speaking the language, it's about speaking an inclusive language.
Certainly, certainly. And I really like what you mentioned with the accessibility issue. I was recently having a conversation with a journalist from Australia. She's originally from Colombia, but she's been working in Australia for a few years, and she's also within this topic of accessibility from the governmental perspective and interviewing people and so on. So I find it very interesting to look at it from a different side of like you said, it's not just speaking, but the language that we use that actually makes a difference in those people's lives. And can you tell us a little bit more about how you got interested in the topic in the first place?
Absolutely. So the topic that I'm super interested in is diversity and inclusion. And to just give a little bit background on why this is important to me, the reason why I speak six languages is not because one day I decided that I was going to go and learn random languages. It's really the story of my life. When I was 5, with my family, we moved from Spain to my home country to France, and we lived there for 5 or 6 years. So I had to learn French, and then we lived in Brazil, and I had to learn Portuguese. And basically, I've lived in 9 countries, very, very different from the ones I mentioned, to Australia, Taiwan, China. Now I live in Hong Kong. And so diversity has always been a part of my life in a positive way, but also in a challenging way, because I was very often the one who did not feel included. I was often the one who did not speak the language. I was often the one who was underrepresented in the group. And so that became very much something that is part of my life. And I thought, well, if I can help other people who also feel excluded for whatever it is, it could be your ethnicity or your religion or your ability or not lack of ability, it's a way to bring people together. And having been in leadership in many years, I worked at Apple for 7 years. I worked at Estee Lauder for more than 2 years. I found that the best way to build teams that are effective is by making them inclusive and making sure that you hear from 100% of the voices, not only the 20% that tend to speak. So that topic for me started like that, as this is part of my life. Then as a leader, it really helped me bring people together, make teams more effective. And inclusive language just falls under that umbrella, the same way that inclusive meetings falls under that umbrella. When you talk about equity or stereotypes, like when you start to peel the onion of inclusion, you see that there are so many topics that we could talk about. And so that's where my passion comes from, and also my expertise.
Perfect. And I believe we have that in common, what you mentioned, that at the very young age you had to move to quite a few different countries, and then of course later on in life you did that as well. And I believe we shared that experience, especially from the first move. I feel is always the most difficult, and everybody looks at you like you're a little bit of an alien, and oh, you don't speak our language, and oh, why do you sound like that? So I can definitely relate to that. And I do find it very interesting that you saw that as a career path as well. I mean, not very specifically, but implementing it almost into everything that you do. Like you said, whether this is leadership or team building or just the language that you speak, and you've had that decision, you've made that decision to continue on with that and not to push it away, that this is not something that I want to come back to in my life, but rather helping others overcome what you've had to overcome yourself, which I believe is very inspiring. And I do wonder, because you mentioned, of course, that with Spanish and with French and with Portuguese and of course with Mandarin that you speak in English clearly, have you noticed the same kind of shift into this inclusive language in all of these different languages, or has English been the most, let's say, dominant in that sphere?
I think the languages, the way that they are built is so different to start with. So, for example, in English, nouns don't have gender, whether it's the table, the sky, or the dog, nothing has a gender. Whereas in Romance language, be it Spanish, French, Portuguese, Romanian, they all have gender. So that makes it even more challenging, because then you have to be more aware of the gender. So I think every language, when it comes to inclusive language, is going to have the different nuances, is going to have different things that you pay attention to. But the most important thing is common to all of them, and it's the mindset of trying to speak inclusively. Because when I delivered the sessions, like last week in Singapore, I didn't talk about a set of words that you need to know to be inclusive. I talked about the principles, and those principles are universal. When I'm saying, for example, that language has to be neutral, that it doesn't matter if you're speaking Chinese or if you're speaking Portuguese. It's about being neutral and making sure that you're not favoring, typically it's men when you say hi guys, or that you're not favoring particular even ethnicity. I gave an example that is the band-aid. I asked the audience, so what color is a band-aid? And everyone went, well, skin color. And I asked, whose skin? And they went,
Yeah,
oh, right.
yeah.
So without realizing, we very often speak a language that is not neutral. And so is the mindset, is the awareness, is the intention. It's also being accurate. Very often we use the term minorities, and we use it very often when we're talking about women. Oh, women are a minority. It's not even accurate. We are not a minority. We are 50 or 51%
Yeah, yeah.
of the population. But in certain scenarios, like for example, in an executive meeting or in a board, we might be underrepresented, but that doesn't make us a minority. And so by being aware of the language that we use, by being aware of the context as well, we make sure that we speak inclusively. And so I like to talk about principles to speak an inclusive language rather than specific words and terms.
And can you tell us a little bit more about these principles? Is there anything that you have that, okay, one, two, three, if you got this right, then everything else will fall into place?
Yes, I mean, I think there are different ways that you can look at these principles, but I like to talk about neutrality. As I just mentioned, I'm going to talk about English language, but most of the languages, they tend to favor men, and without realizing, but we say the chairman, we say mankind, we say man hours, we say policeman. So if we're neutral, instead of saying man, we would replace with human or person. So we might say the chairperson. Instead of mankind, we might say humankind. Instead of the fireman, we say the fire, let me say the fire person, but the principle is this idea of being neutral. Then the second principle is being accurate. As I mentioned before, there are terms like when we say minority, that is actually not very accurate. But to give you some examples, because it brings life, very often we see disabled toilet or disabled bathroom. And would you, if you think about the word, would you actually use a bathroom that is disabled?
Maybe not.
So exactly. So if you think about the word, it's not a disabled bathroom, it's an accessible bathroom because it's for people who have that accessibility request. So again, that's being accurate. When we're talking about the color, the example of the Band-Aid, instead of saying skin color, we actually define the color. We are being more accurate. So being accurate really helps. And there was an example that I provided as well, which was a story that happened here in Hong Kong. I went to an immersion day for my daughter, who is 5 years old, and all the parents were together, and the principal invited one of the moms to go on stage to talk about her daughter. So we didn't know why she was going to talk about her daughter. It turns out that this mom has a daughter who is 5 years old as well, and she has dwarfism. So she wanted to explain to us how to speak in an inclusive language so that we educate our kids as well, and her daughter does not feel like an outsider, does not feel that she's different because she's just like the other kids. It doesn't matter. She's a little bit smaller, but that's it. And so she told us, we don't say a person, we don't call this person a dwarf. We say that is a person with dwarfism. Saying dwarf is very offensive. And she said also that something that resonated with me that I hadn't even thought about. She said, and when you're talking about your height, or when you're talking about your kid's height, please don't say normal height, use average height. And that example really brought this to life because it's about being neutral, but it's also about being accurate. Like it's average, there's no normal or not normal. And then when you're saying normal, you're also making the assumption that whoever is not in that group is not normal, so you're excluding. So that's another principle that I like to use, the accuracy. There's a third one that is people first. And I love this one because it's very easy to remember. And basically what it means is, when possible, use the person first. So instead of saying a disabled person, you can say a person with a disability. Or instead of saying an autistic person, you say a person with autism, because our brains, we are sequential. So when we say person first, we are actually putting the focus on the individual, on the person. And I found that that's a beautiful concept. It's very easy to remember. So when I talk about principles, that's the one that people go like, oh yeah, this is very easy. I can implement it straight away. And the last one that is also very important, and it goes back to languages in general, is when you speak your language or when you're learning another language, it's all about the context. If you think about it, it's not just about learning a bunch of words, but it's really understanding that if you're maybe speaking to your boss, or if you're speaking in a business setting, you speak with certain terms and you speak in a certain way. And when you're talking to your kids, you might even use different words. And it's very similar when you think of inclusive language. It's all about the context. And to give a specific example, I just said that in general, saying person with autism is a nice thing because you're putting the person first and it's very inclusive. One of my friends who has autism, he said, actually, I prefer to be called an autistic person because it's a very part of my personality. That's how I define myself. And so I'm very comfortable. And so context is about understanding, how do you make the person in front of you feel included? For some people, when you say, hi guys, it's totally fine. They don't feel excluded. But some women, especially if you're very feminine, they'll be like, you know what, that's not a term that I'm comfortable with. So trying to always be aware of the context. I gave another example as well that helps people understand what I mean by the context. Sometimes my husband and my friend, they refer to me as a girl. Oh, Veronica and the girls are going to go out for dinner, for example. And it's just like a more informal way of referring to me and my friends. We are not girls, but it's just very, very casual, and there's nothing wrong with saying that. But if I'm in a meeting and they say, oh yes, let's listen to this girl, I would feel very offended. I would feel that I'm diminished, and it's the same word. So It's about the context. So bringing everything together, neutrality, making sure that you're not favoring any gender or any ethnicity or person with or without a disability. Accuracy, very important. Use a language that really reflects the reality. Using a person first always helps put the focus on the human denominator. And the last one is context. So for me, these are like the four principles that I like to use. And it's not one or the other, it's just general principles that can help you go in the right direction. And the reality is we are going to make mistakes and we are going to say things that are potentially going to make people feel excluded, just like when you're learning any language, and it's part of it. But as long as you are honest and you are self-aware and also just being very, very humble, as in we all make mistakes. So we are all learning. I'm learning, and every day, especially if it's people who have a very different lived experience from mine, I might say things that are wrong, or I might say to someone, oh, we have to order a special meal for you, for example, for someone who is vegan. And that person might feel actually it's not a special meal. I just want to eat what I eat. I don't want to be felt that I'm special.
And I'd love to dig a little bit deeper into what you just said with making mistakes, because that's an invaluable part of life, whether, like you said, whether that's language learning, whether that's just the way that you speak, whether that's anything really that you embark on. Can you tell us a little bit more about your mentality with your perhaps your the way that you look at your own mistakes? And we briefly talked about that last time, that you don't really take them too seriously, especially language related, that you just laugh them off. But can you tell us a little bit more about your, let's say, general principles when it comes to making mistakes?
Yes, of course. And I honestly think mistakes is really how we learn. Like we learn riding a bike by going into the bike and falling and trying again. But for me, I think learning languages from a very young age really made this idea of making mistakes very, I normalized it from a very young age, because you have to, as a kid, you don't care. Like my children, they don't care if they make a mistake. You're just learning and you repeat the word until people understand. And so that was my life, going into different countries and speaking the language, and especially with the accent, getting the accent wrong. And as a kid, I didn't really care if people laughed or not. You don't really have those filters. It's as adults, we become very rigid and we become very self-aware and we take ourselves very seriously. And I always try to remind myself that the best way of learning is by making those mistakes. So when I was learning Chinese, again, I learned Chinese in my early 20s when I moved to Taiwan. And I was making mistakes, and I still do, because the language is not only very difficult in terms of the characters, but the tones and the phonetics of the language is very different. Mandarin has four tones, which means that when you're saying la, basically you have four different ways of saying la, 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 and each of them is going to mean something different. To me, at the beginning, they all sounded the same. So I made all these mistakes. And I think applying this mindset of languages, of making mistakes into life, has really helped me be very agile. So, for example, I don't try to make things perfect. Like I launched a newsletter on a Substack early this year. I'm terrible at design. It's definitely not my thing, but I was like, you know what? I'm just going to launch it. I'm going to start here. And I know that it's not going to be perfect, but at least I have a baseline. And then once you have a baseline, you can only improve from there. And that's the advice and the encouragement that I give to anyone who is learning languages. Start somewhere and don't be afraid of making mistakes and people laughing at you, which honestly doesn't happen very often. It's more in your mindset. Is that really start with wherever your body is. Don't look at other people. It doesn't matter. You start with you start, and then you start doing little steps, and mistakes along the way.
And that's a wonderful point that you just made here. And I noticed that with 99% of my students as well, that, oh, what if they laugh at me? What if they look at me weird? But has that ever actually happened to you? Well, no. And it probably will not. So that's a really wonderful point that you made here for sure. And I really like that we're let's say turning into languages. I'm wondering if you have any maybe practical tips for somebody, like you said, because I feel like this is something that's easy for people to hear and easy to, oh yeah, I should just make mistakes, but the actual mindset behind it is sometimes or most of the time much more challenging to work through. Do you have any practical tips or any maybe tricks perhaps for somebody that's in that space that, okay, maybe I've been learning Spanish or French or whatever language and I'm there, but I just don't really know how to move past the initial stages of, let's say, the A2s or the B1s where I feel most people get stuck. What are your tips to get to that fluent level that you got to?
Mm, I think very often I like to compare learning a language to going to the gym. You know, when you're all excited and you're like, okay, I'm gonna go for my bikini mission and the gym. And then you go one day, and then you go a few days, and you look at the mirror and you don't really see a big difference. And then this goes on, and maybe after a few months, you even still don't see a big difference. And it's a bit the same with languages. Sometimes you feel that you plateau or that you're not making a real progress, but you have to know that it's a journey. Like even in my case, I've been studying Chinese for years, and it's not like you tick a box or you finish an exam or you get on the scale and you see a number. You don't stop there. You don't stop being healthy because you hit a number. You say, oh, today I'm fit, I'm done. I think with languages it's the same. It's this mindset of constantly learning, of constantly continue to put the effort in. So having this mindset of continuous improvement, and it's like going to the gym. It's a lifestyle. If you decided to go for languages, it's part of your life. For me, it's not just a tick the box. That's the first thing. The second thing is creating an environment. You have to create a conducive environment for learning the language. And today, it wasn't the same when I started learning languages, but with technology, you have so many resources. You have so much access to creating that environment, whether it's when you're going for a walk or a run, you have your podcast, for example, and you can have like a very basic podcast or even a course, even a language course in that language. What I personally like to do is watching Netflix in any of the other languages. And I do it because I actually enjoy, I want to watch that series, and it helps me passive learning. It's very often words that you think you forgot, and then you hear it like, oh, I actually knew that word. So I find that passive learning is really, really amazing. And you can do the same with books. You can do the same with audios. Something that I used to do when I was in the corporate world and I was commuting 30 minutes each way. I had the Duolingo app for Chinese, which for people who don't know is a very simple app. It's more for beginner to intermediate. You have every single language, pretty much, even Latin, by the way, and very like snackable modules. So you can do that on your way to work. You're probably scrolling through your Facebook or your Instagram anyways. So you can dedicate like those blocks of time that are usually kind of wasted time into languages. So I find that creating this conducive environment is very useful. And the third one, when you see, okay, but I'm really stuck, nothing of that. I have my habit, I have all of these, and I'm not getting better. Then I think it's shock therapy. It's like, okay, then you need to go to the next level. Whether you decide to have an intensive course in the country, because
Mm.
very often people who feel stuck is people who have not moved, who don't live in the country. I find very difficult to learn a language when you're not living there. I actually fail myself. One of the languages that I don't count as part of the six is German. I studied German for 4 years, a lot of German, maybe 3 hours a week at school for 4 years. I never lived in Germany, and I was never able to become fluent. And I think, of course, I don't know, but had I really gone for like a 6 month experience in Germany, or have maybe like an intensive course, it would have been different. But if you're not in the country, then maybe think of how you can recreate that environment. Maybe it's like a group from that nationality, or maybe it's really doing that. Is a can you? Of course, your life circumstances get everyone's is different, but doing a language immersion, it really pays off. And sometimes all you need is, I would say, 3 months. When I went to China without speaking any Chinese, it was intensive. I did 4 hours of class every day for 3 months, and then I still studied by my side in the afternoon. After 3 months, I was able to have a basic conversational Chinese that allowed me to actually negotiate a flat when I moved to Shanghai in Chinese because they didn't speak English.
Oh.
So it was very intense and dedicated. But if you put the focus and if you're really disciplined, you can do it. But you have to be willing to do it and, dedicate that time.
Certainly, certainly. And like you said, it's all about finding where you are personally, because like you said, if Duolingo works for you at the beginning, awesome. If something else works for you, that's fantastic. If nothing works for you, just go there. Like you said, I really love that shock therapy. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just finding whatever works for you, I suppose, which is something that I feel like a lot of people get stuck on, that, oh, what's the best way to learn and what's the best way to progress and what's the best way to learn vocabulary. Well, this is maybe what worked for me. Maybe something else will work for you, but I believe that listening to all of these different strategies, that, oh, I did this and I did this and I did that and I did that, and one day something just clicks and miracles and and all of a
Exactly.
sudden you become fluent.
Yes, exactly right. It is really about the principles. Creating a conducive environment, yes, you need that. But what that environment looks like for you is very different. It's going to depend on the time that you have available. It's going to depend on your preferences in terms of technology. So, yeah, everyone's journey is going to be different.
And Veronica, talk to me a little bit more about the lemon tree mindset.
So the Lemon Tree Mindset, that's my first book that I published on Amazon. I published it in February. And the name, because a lot of people are very curious about the name. So in English, as you know, whenever you have challenges, we use the expression, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. But I actually thought that when life gives you lemons, what you should really do is take the seeds and plant your own lemon tree. So that's where the name comes from. Of course, is the mindset of the challenges period, of overcoming obstacles and barriers when they come your way. Why did I decide to write this? Well, it was at a point in my life where life kind of shook everything upside down. And I left Hong Kong with my two daughters on holiday. So this was in 2020. And we were 2021, sorry, and we were not able to come back because of the quarantine and the COVID policies and all of that. So basically, I ended up with my very young daughters, 3 and 4 at the time, in Australia, and I was trying to find a job, juggle the two kids as a single mom at that time. And I got a lot of rejection from the corporate world. I wasn't able to find a job. I felt that I didn't have a network in Australia. I was a foreigner. I didn't have experience in that particular market. And so I struggled. And for months, I went through this process of feeling a lot of rejection and having a lot of ghosting from recruiters. And so one day I woke up and I said, okay, I have to focus on the things that I can control. So what is it that I can control? And with this mindset, I started to say, well, if I don't have a network, I'm going to build it. So I started to build my network on LinkedIn. If the recruiters and the companies don't see my value, I'm going to show my value because I know that I have value to give, because everybody has value to give. I started to create a lot of content. I started to write articles on LinkedIn. I started to write as well on Medium, which is a platform for writers. And I really started to share my stories. Some of the times it was just sharing what I was learning about. And I didn't have like this master plan, but I was really reinventing myself without even knowing it. And every day it was really incremental. I was doing something else. I created my own website, and I didn't want to spend a lot of budget. So I found out myself, how do I create a website? And then early this year, I launched my newsletter, and everything was incremental. And now it's 10 months later. So this beginning of this journey started in August last year. And when I look back, everything that I've been talking about today, me becoming a consultant, starting to do public speaking, starting to write, everything happened in 10 months. And I thought, wow, I'm the most fulfilled I've ever been in my life, professionally speaking. And I think I have a story that can first motivate or inspire people who feel a little bit lost, like I was, but more importantly, because inspiration alone, it doesn't really do anything. It gives you like this good, adrenaline moment, and then it dies down. So I decided, well, what exactly did I do? What are the steps that I took to reinvent myself? And the book is really a framework on how do you start? What is your value? What are the things that you're passionate about? Then from there, it's like, well, build your value proposition based on that. And once you have your value proposition, how do you start to monetize it? How do you start to build your brand? how do you start to create your network? So it was really the different steps that I followed. So that's the lemon tree mindset. It is the 19 steps that I follow and that anyone can follow to reinvent themselves, to find a new path, or just, as I said, get some inspiration if you want to explore something different.
And have you had any favorite moments within that journey? Maybe, like you said, the newsletter or actually publishing the book, I would imagine would be a huge experience. But have you had any favorite moments along that journey?
I think the publishing was a super special moment because
Yeah.
I never thought that I was going to write, let alone publish a book. So that was huge. But there was a moment in particular, and this was December, when a company that I didn't know, I hadn't even heard of them, contacted me and said, "We love the work that you're doing on inclusion to advocate and champion diversity and inclusion on social channels. And we would like to nominate you for an award for Diversity Lead of the Year in Asia in 2023." And I was blown away because I didn't even have a job at the time. I was just trying to figure out, but I was very, very vocal and very active, and I was sharing stories, and I was really from my heart trying to share what I know, what I'm learning, what my story is, how I can help people. And the fact that a company somewhere notices what I was doing when I thought that I didn't really have a voice, I didn't have a job, I was not a technical leader, for me was a wow moment on that made me realize, wow, me, but everyone, we have a voice, we have a story. And I think very often we don't think that we do. And so we don't share our story, we don't advocate for things that are important to us, that matter. And I discovered that we all do, and especially with the accessibility that we have today to networks, be it Twitter, YouTube, if you like videos, or TikTok, whatever it is, you can really leverage the power of technologies in your advantage to make sure that you send your message across, but that you build your brand too. Like I used to work for big brands like Apple and Estee Lauder, and honestly, when I stopped working there, I didn't have the brand anymore. Like if you ask, oh, what does Veronica do? People wouldn't know. I used to be Veronica from Apple, and now a few people on LinkedIn connections, they refer to me as the DEI lady, DEI for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I think is amazing.
Well, that's wonderful. And like you said, it all starts with that single step that you decided to take, with that single decision of I'm just going to put myself out there. I'm going to create my own community. I'm going to plant my own lemon tree, almost in that sense, that I will just do what I can control and let life, figure out the rest. Because I find that a lot of people get stuck in that moment that, oh, what if it doesn't work out? What if, I don't know, people don't like what I'm writing? What if people don't like my videos and so on and so on? Well, you will never know until you try, and maybe you will get nominated for an award less than a year later. So you never know what life holds for you, I suppose. No, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And to talk to me a little bit more about your public speaking, because I think that's one of those, another one of those things that people have this huge image of tens of thousands of people and trembling with a microphone and so on. So, what has your experience been like for public speaking?
So again, it has been incremental. Last year, when I was in this reinvention process, I started to think, well, how can I build this network and how can I use different channels to send my message? So as I mentioned, I started to create content on LinkedIn, but I also started to reach out to podcast hosts. And again, it was a change in mindset. I had never thought of speaking on a podcast. I always thought, oh, this is for the others. So I reached out, and at the beginning, I don't know, maybe I sent 20 pitches, and no one really invited me or got back to me. And then I did the first one. And once I did the first one, it's always like that. Like you do something for the first time, and you're like, oh wow, I did it once, I can do it again. So this was the first one, was maybe in September or something like that. Now I've done between 15 and 20. I don't know how many, but whenever now I go into a podcast, I go very relaxed and confident because I have done it before. But my first time, I was so hesitant. And
Yeah.
am I going to interrupt the host? And am I going to say something that is
Yeah.
not right? So I think practice helps a lot with that. And I do find there are many ways that you can get to the public speaking journey or channel if that's what you want to do. But the podcast, I found that it's a very safe way of doing it because you don't feel that you have these 10,000s of people, even if they watch it afterwards, but
Yeah.
mentally, these people and all these eyes, looking at you. So I find that that was a very good way to get started. What I do as well is once a week, starting in January, I partner with a personal brand strategist who is called Petra Zink. She's based in Australia. And we do a personal brand, we call it the Personal Brand Express. So it's a LinkedIn Live. We do 30 minutes. It's very quick. We talk about many different topics related to personal brand. How do you build authority? How do you find your content pillars? How can you monetize your personal brand? So a lot of different topics. And it's great because it's live. So we have some of the people in the audience who ask questions. So that's at the next level because it's live and you're there with the audience. And then the next step of really starting to speak in events and conferences, again, was by putting my hand out there. And I reached out to conferences and hosts who were still looking for speakers. So that was the first step, me reaching out and saying, okay, I'm going to put my hand up. And then the next step is once you start doing these things and people see you, I would say the last three companies that I have partnered with for different public speaking, where I'm one of their freelance speakers, they actually contacted me because that's usually how it works. And even for the podcast today, you were the one who contacted me because it's great. Like you start to build those relationships, you start to be more visible in your channel. So it's always like this journey that when you're zooming in, you don't realize that you're growing and developing. But when you zoom out, I'm like, wow, 10 months ago, I hadn't even done a podcast. And now I have done multiple podcasts, interviews. I've been speaking in public in different events. But it's always taking the step that is going to take you out of your comfort zone. And I think once you take that step, it's like, okay, I was able to speak in front of 100 people. It wasn't that bad. I did it.
Right.
So people say, it's cliche, but it's true, is getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. And once you've done it, even if it's just once, you can say, yes, I'm a public speaker because you've done it. You've proved yourself.
And would you say that that's been your, or maybe one of the biggest lessons that you've learned about yourself on that journey? Because I would imagine before you do that, like you said, it all seems intimidating and it's for the others, like you said, and that's very much a very common mindset, I believe. And then once you do it, you see that, oh, that wasn't so bad. Would you say that that's one of the biggest lessons that you've learned about yourself, about the way that you see yourself, or has there been anything else that you've noticed?
The first one is getting rid of limiting beliefs. I think we all have, even if we think that we don't, we all tell ourselves these things that put us in a box, like, oh, I'm not a public speaker. Or I hear very often people say, I'm not a natural. I'm not a natural at whatever it is, whether it's public speaking, I'm not a natural at languages. And removing these filters that we have about ourselves and really letting yourself dream and expand and get out of that box has really helped me. Because like a year ago, I would never have dared to say, oh, I would love to speak at a TEDx. And today I don't have any TEDx in the pipeline, but I'm able to say I would love to speak at a TEDx, and I actually will. I want to make it happen. I have the potential. Maybe I'm not there yet, but this mindset of unlocking your potential is so important. So that's the first thing. If you don't have the mindset, if you don't believe that you are going to speak at a TEDx or that you are going to be a published author, how are you going to get there? So that mindset is really important. And then once you have that mindset, it's about the building blocks. It's like, it's true. One of my goals is to speak at a TEDx. What do I have to do to get there? I have to speak in conferences. I have to invest in my public speaking because I need to refine my skills. I need to have more visibility. So it's all these things, but it's continuously challenging yourself. And another example, last week, there was another woman who contacted me, a podcast host, to speak in a podcast. And she told me that it was going to be in Portuguese. And Portuguese is one of the languages that I speak fluently. But even when you say that you speak a language fluently, if you're not used to speaking it, especially in a business setting, It's
No.
very different. Even this conversation in Spanish, my mother tongue, would be more difficult for me to do it in Spanish than to do it in English. So when she told me, my first reaction was like, oh, I don't know that I'm ready. I haven't really spoken Portuguese in this setting ever, really. Excuse me. And I decided to do it. I'm like, okay, I know that I speak the language, even if it's not perfect. I think people are going to be understanding that it's not my first language. And in the end, it went really well. And if I had to do it again in Portuguese, I'll be like, yeah, I've done it.
And that's one of those things that I think a lot of people have the misconception of, especially I find with just the second language. I feel it sort of fades away after the third one and so on. But people, I think, or a lot of my students at least have that belief that I have to know everything in that language to consider myself fluent. And I feel like that's another one of those limiting beliefs that you're talking about. That I mean, I cannot talk about chemistry in Polish, for example. I could maybe a little bit in English, but in Polish I would have zero idea of what to say, and yet I still consider myself fluent in both of these languages, and yet still, like you said, with public speaking and with business in English, it's just such a common topic, whereas in another language, maybe you don't have a lot of experience talking about it, but that doesn't mean that you can't speak it or you're not good enough. But you just haven't had that experience yet, which is something that you're proving as well, that you just have to do it once and then you see, oh, I can actually do that. So it is certainly coming
Exactly.
back to exactly what you're talking about, just putting yourself out there and allowing yourself to break these walls.
Exactly. And one thing on public speaking, more tactical now. So we've talked about the mindset and we've talked about the building blocks, but things that help in any language. First is the breathing. I'm getting coaching on public speaking, and one of the things, especially when you feel a bit nervous or when someone
Hmm.
might throw a question at you, I'm doing a module on managing challenging questions. We tend to be very accelerated and we tend to breathe hard and jump to answer. And what we have to do is the opposite. It's just take a breath and be in control, be concise in your answers. If you have to pause, don't do the or start to rumble around. Just be very clear, be composed. The example that we use is the swan. How does the swan? What does the swan look like? When you look above the water, everything is calm and relaxed and composed. But under the water, it's just like a mess, and there's a lot happening, and there's a lot of movement. And it's a little bit the same when you're speaking in public. Of course, you're under pressure, and you're going to have like all these thoughts in your mind. But you can control how you breathe, and you can control your tone, and you can control having pauses. So in public speaking, that is so important. And especially if it's in a foreign language, it gives it even a little bit more time to think and not to rush and make sure that you are speaking in a very clear and more articulate way.
And have you been using that in your daily life as well, or maybe in just general stressful situations, not even public speaking, but what do I do in this context, or what should I do? Do you use that in your, let's say, daily problems as well? Just taking that breath that, okay, I don't have to react immediately. I can take a few seconds to just calm myself down, compose myself, and then respond to that situation.
100%. And I'm not an expert in meditation. I'm not an expert in breathing, but I do know the benefits of just the breathing and letting things calm and recomposing yourself. So very often, especially with young kids, you have to have a lot of patience. So I'm like, okay, so I try to do it in many situations, especially situations of stress or where you're under pressure. Instead of reacting, is kind of taking a step backwards and having this very calm moment of saying, okay, I want to be in control.
And is there something that you believe that you can do to be more proactive? Again, if we come back to your public speaking and speaking at conferences, you mentioned that if somebody asks you a question, would you say that a point of that mental stability almost is just being confident and comfortable with what you know? Because something that I'm thinking about, and the reason why I'm asking this question is I'm wondering with if you have very limited knowledge on a topic and somebody asks you a question, then you almost feel attacked that, I don't know what I'm supposed to say here. But if you're very comfortable with, yes, I know exactly what I'm talking about, I can give you examples, I can give you the exceptions and so on. Do you feel like that's an important part of having that confidence to, of course, on top of the breathing, to be more proactive in confidence?
Yes, of course, being very knowledgeable and owning your content is going to give you that confidence. The more you know the actual subject and the more you have practice as well, the more you set yourself up for success. But the reality is, very often, and especially in specific settings where it might be more like a workshop, more interactive, you might have these questions and you don't know the answer. And that is probably going to happen because we don't know everything. And so I think being prepared, and that's one of the modules that I deliver on managing challenging questions, and how we approach it is really by having this mindset of being very honest and be very transparent about, this is what I know and this is what I can find out. And don't ramble, don't say, oh, this is a great question, or start to even repeat the question. It's more being in control and saying, well, this is what I know about this X topic. That particular question, I don't have the answer right now, but it could be we're going to find out together, or it could be, but I have a resource and I'm going to get back to you. So when I was working at Apple, very often it was more with client meetings, but because it was on the business side of things, they would have very technical questions, and I'm not a technical person. So I would often say, actually, about this specific point, I understand that this is what you want to know. I don't have the answer, but we have a team with my solutions engineer. And so it's thinking bigger than just you. In the end, what you want is to answer that question or that concern. So whether you have the answer or someone else knows, is about being very transparent and try to be resourceful. So don't get stuck in the, oh my God, I don't know the answer. As well, how are we going to find out about this answer?
That draws, I think, a very nice circle to what you were talking about before with not trying to be perfect in everything that you do, not trying to be over knowledgeable and so on. And oh, yes, I know everything and no question can break me down, but rather, okay, yes, I genuinely just don't know the answer to that. Let somebody else answer that. Let somebody else share their knowledge and share their expertise. And that, I would say, creates a very nice circle into, I suppose, creating yourself almost in a way that you decide who you want to be and you decide what qualities you want to have. You decide what qualities perhaps you don't want to have. Like you said, maybe you're not a tech person and you do not wish to be a tech person, then let's just leave that be and focusing, like you said, on your public speaking and working more so in that direction. And I really like how you framed that in, this is my goal, how do I work backwards? Instead of, okay, I need to learn more words and I need to do this and I need to do that. And then at the end of the day, you're wondering, what was I doing? And I think that's something that a lot of people can benefit from, whether that's public speaking or language or anything really, whether it's job related or not. Having a very specific goal in mind that, okay, I want to speak at TED, or I want to get this particular position, or I want to create my own brand. How do I work backwards with that? That's a really wonderful.
Yes, it's one of the lessons of the lemon tree mindset is the reverse engineer success. And I love this expression. I don't think we have it in my language in Spanish. And it's the idea of success and how you reverse engineer to go backwards and say, okay, what are the steps that I need to take to get there?
And tell me, Veronica, is there anything that we haven't touched on yet that you would like to share as a final piece of wisdom, perhaps?
I think that the final piece of wisdom, I don't know if I call it wisdom, but what really helps, and we haven't really touched about it, is the why. You need to have a strong why, whether it's for learning a language or whether it's about public speaking or whatever it is. And specifically in the case of language, very often I hear people who say, oh, I want to speak a language. And when I ask why, they say because it sounds nice or because they saw something that inspired them to study the language. You have to have a very strong reason. For me, it was survival sometimes when I moved to China. It was a necessity. For some people, it's maybe they want to speak with their partner or with their partner's family. But I think always having a strong why is what helps you course correct when you get a bit lost. And it's one of the final lessons of the lemon tree mindset is really that in this journey, it all sounds that it's step by step and everything is like very incremental, but it's not. You're gonna be derailed at some times, you're gonna feel a little bit lost. And that's when having a clear why is what's gonna help you go back to the gym or study again or go back to your business. So start with the why and go back to the why when you need it.
Very, very wise, I would say, even if not wisdom, still wise anyway. And as you've said before, for anybody listening that wants to find you, you mentioned that you do Substack, right? And you write on, remind me one more time.
Is my main platform. And if there are readers or writers or people who would like to start writing, Medium is a really great platform. It's a platform where you can write articles of any length, any topic, any style. That's how I started my writing career. I published my first article in August, and now 10 months later, I've published 412, I think. And that gave me the confidence to actually write my first book. So for the audience, if anyone is interested in writing, I definitely recommend Medium as a platform.
Medium, wonderful. And you also mentioned that you have your website, LinkedIn, of course. Is there anywhere else that people can find you?
Books,
Of course, good point. Good point.
I think
Perfect.
that's all.
I saw recently on your LinkedIn that you are now in a bookstore in Hong Kong, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, so that was yesterday. So my two books, so one is The Lemon Tree Mindset, the second one is The Conquering Your Burnout. So I launched them first in Amazon, and I just signed an agreement with the leading bookstore for English books in Hong Kong. So now if anyone is in Hong Kong, they can actually find them in.
Very impressive. Very impressive. Well, thank you so much, Veronica. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you today, and I believe you shared some really great lessons for anybody listening that I'm sure everybody can very greatly benefit from that.
Thank you, Marty, and I hope to continue the conversation.
Me too. Me too. Hey, I'm glad to see you here. Let me know what you most enjoyed about this conversation, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one. Do zobaczenia.